Well, hello, everyone. In the interest of everyone's time, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I know probably a few people are still logging in. I am Akia Lewis. I'm the Strategic Innovation and Get Georgia Reading Project Manager, i.e., one half of the two people who support the campaign. And we're very, very pleased to have you with us here today. I see we have international representation and representation outside of Georgia within the United States. That's awesome. I'm sure you all had quite a number of Zoom calls you could be on today. We're grateful that you decided to be here with us. Just a bit of housekeeping. We do have everyone on mute, but we invite you to keep your camera on if you'd like to share your lovely face with us. And we thank you again for being here. We also want to encourage you to use the chat to introduce yourself for any questions you may have as we go through. We'll get to those at the end. We want to engage you as much as possible. And speaking of thanks, none of this would be possible without the Sandra Dunnigan Deal Center for Early Language and Literacy at Georgia College. The Deal Center has been a strong partner, a core partner of the campaign since its founding. And its leader is here with us today, Dr. Teresa McGorry-LaBelle. Teresa, would you like to say a few words of welcome today?
Yes, thank you, Akia. Good afternoon, everyone. And on behalf of the Deal Center team and in partnership with the Get Georgia Reading Campaign, welcome to our virtual learning series with early language and literacy experts. As Akia said, my name is Teresa McGorry-LaBelle, and I'm the Executive Director of the Deal Center, which is housed at Georgia College. And we do have a statewide mission to improve literacy rates for the children and families of Georgia. We work every day under the thinking and the promise that literacy changes lives. And we work so hard to put that promise into policy, and first practice and then policy. So we are a research and training facility for the advancement of early language and literacy development. Our quest is to embed evidence-based practices in organizations working with children birth to age 8. By focusing on key areas of research and quality improvement, professional learning, and community engagement. I am so excited that you have joined us today and grateful for your participation today, because in these upcoming sessions, you are going to have the opportunity to learn how to support early language and literacy development rooted in science for transformational change and sustainability. If you were not able to join us today, and if you want to share this with your colleagues, our presentations are available on our website. The videos are available. This one probably, and the two that are upcoming this week, will not be available until about next week, but please go to our website in the next couple of weeks. Check us out now, because you'll see some of our previous presentations. So without further delay, I will turn this over to our presenters and enjoy your time with our virtual learning series. Thank you.
I do want to just give a brief intro to our presenters. We have with us today Dr. Gary McGivney, who is the Deputy State Superintendent for the Office of School Safety and Climate, and Ariane Weldon, who is the other half of the Get Georgia Reading Campaign. Take it away, Dr. McGivney.
Hello, everyone. As Akia said, I'm Gary McGivney with the Georgia Department of Education. With me today is Ariane Weldon, who is the Strategic Innovation Manager and Get Georgia Reading Campaign Director for Georgia Connection Partnership. And welcome to the presentation, Language as a Missing Link. Let me ask you this question. Have you ever been frustrated with the system? I'm sure you have, and you probably also experienced how difficult it is to change that system, right? That's why this quote really resonates, because if we cannot change a system, maybe it's on us to create a new system that makes the old system obsolete. You know what the psychologists say about getting rid of a bad habit? To be successful, you have to replace a bad habit with a good habit. To change a system that's not what it should be, let's think about creating a new system. But how do we do that? Most of us live in the remedy system. Why? Because we are extremely busy with a long checklist of things to do. Many times we measure our success by how many items we check off on our checklist. And if you admit it, You probably add a couple items to your checklist that you've already done just so you can check them off, right? That's okay. We all do that. But let's look at this slide for a moment, because the distinction between a remedy and a solution is really important and can determine really your effectiveness and over time even your feelings of self-worth. That's right. This system of either remedy or solution can impact your feelings of self-worth and even the happiness in the work that you do. What happens if you're remedy focused? What that means is that you are, of course, interested in the problem, but you're responding to the presenting problem instead of looking for the basic problems, because you're task driven instead of purpose driven. You remember the best-selling book a few years ago entitled The Purpose-Driven Life? You know, that book that was a bestseller on the bestseller list for years, and everybody claimed they read it, whether they read it or not, because you were all pressured to claim that you read it. Anyway, those of you who read it, do you remember the first sentence in the book? I know you're thinking about that now. The first sentence in the book is, quote, "It's not about you." And I'm sorry to have to say this, ladies and gentlemen, but when you are remedy focused, it is about you. You chase the problems and you search for remedies, quick fixes, so you can move on to something else, because like all of us, you're very, very busy. You have many things to do. You have people waiting on you. But what happens when we remain in the remedy system, where we address just the presenting problem? And you know what's coming. That's right. You knew that was coming, right? You knew the answer before I showed it. The problems come back to you. The problems come back because the basic problem that has not been addressed. You're just dealing with the presenting problems. And two things happen when you chase problems. One, you never catch the problem. Number two, it wears you down physically and emotionally. It burns you out professionally and personally. This is why teachers and administrators around March of each year are looking at the school calendar, hoping that the end of the year is closer than they remembered it being. They're burned out from chasing problems. This is why many people in other professions burn out too, because they spend so much time chasing the same problems. So if the remedy system is so bad, why do we stay in the remedy system? Well, the reason we stay there is because we think it works. It gets us through the day. Even after I point this out today, some of you will remain in the remedy system, even though you want to switch to the solution system, where you find the basic problems. Why? It's not only because you think you're too busy to seek solutions, you don't have time to look for basic problems. It's also because your perception of behavior is stuck in the remedy system perspective. So today we're going to focus on a basic problem that too often is part of the remedy system. A basic problem that receives very little, if any, attention. And what is that? Developmentally appropriate language skills. A significant number of our children and adolescents, the research shows, cannot express or channel their frustrations or express their needs and responses to what is going on around them because they do not have the necessary language skills. So some of them act out as a form of communications. In other words, as juvenile court judge Peggy Walker said, quote, "When children don't have language, their behavior becomes their language." So what is a common view of the existing system?
Does this look familiar to anybody? I'm seeing some smiling faces. So 17-year-old high school dropout. That's the story on that kid right there. So here's the thing. These numbers and files can't talk. But what if they could? What if those numbers and files could talk? What if they could tell you a story? What if they told us we got the story wrong? And that our remedy is not a solution. So a file folder full of remedies. So then the question is, how do we move from remedies to solutions? We suggest looking at the system from an epidemiological perspective. more people are familiar with epidemiology these days, I think. We think with our current situation. But there are a couple of basic tenets from epidemiology that can be applied in your everyday work. So two basic tenets we know from looking at diseases, that they don't occur by chance. Now, as I walk you through this kind of very basic overview of the principles of epidemiology, please pay close attention because you're going to have a quiz later on in this presentation. So two basic tenets. Diseases don't occur by chance. There are always factors that influence a disease to occur. We may not know what all those factors are, but we know there are factors that influence. And the second is they're not random. Patterns of those factors provide us with clues to inform solutions. And when we think about behaviors and children's and adolescent behaviors, the same is true. Behaviors, they don't occur by chance. There are always factors that influence behavior to occur. They're not random. They're actually patterns of factors that provide clues to inform solutions. And again, in other words, if we look at things a little bit differently, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So starting with some real basics here regarding language. The ability to communicate is fundamental to child and adolescent social, emotional, and cognitive development. And think about this, language is a vehicle. So language is a significant vehicle by which children and adolescents communicate their needs and ideas with others, develop and maintain relationships, and solidify their understanding of concepts. So language is foundational to all of these things. And again, all of these things sort of part of what it means to be human. This concept of language nutrition is something that we can use and build on from birth up to adulthood. Language nutrition is defined as the abundant, positive, and language-rich social interactions that ensure the brain's architecture is forming the neural connections needed for social and emotional development, self-regulation, and executive function. So a note about terms, a note about language. Have you ever heard this term, speech language? Have you ever stopped to think about, do I say speech language, or have I thought about what is speech? What is language? And sometimes in education, we can kind of put those things together too quickly and maybe focus on one area. It's important to understand some of the distinctions. When it comes to speech skills are about producing sounds accurately. We think some of these examples are going to be familiar. Articulation, very common. How we make speech sounds using the mouth, lips, and tongue. So saying the word rabbit instead of wabbit. So that's an articulation example. Fluency, the rhythm of our speech. So again, these are really specific to speech and the sounds and the ability to say sounds accurately. Language skills deal with meaning. So for example, expressive language, the use of words, sentences, gestures, and writing to convey meaning and messages to others. So again, back to meaning and back to engaging with other people. Receptive language, the ability to understand the meaning of what's being communicated. And it can be verbal, written, sign language, but understanding others and understanding the written word. And pragmatic language, the social communication skills used to interact with others. So this deals with what we say, how we say it, nonverbal communication, just as important as verbal communication. So we use eye contact, facial expressions, body language. You use that every day, and it's kind of very comfortable to you. And knowing how appropriate our interactions are in a given situation. So prevalence. At least 12% of children entering school have language difficulties that hinder their social development and educational progress. So again, we're focusing in on language specifically here. And at least 12% of kids who enter school. What's important here is we know from research that language difficulties will significantly predict problems with behavioral, mental health, and academic outcomes. So remember those factors that influence, and understanding from epidemiology factors that influence, we already start to see a connection here. The role of developmentally appropriate language skills as a missing link, and I will say a lot more in the United States from what we've seen in the research as a missing link for children and adolescents with behavior problems, has been considered only recently. Really a missing link we've seen, and a lot of the research we've looked at that we're going to reference today comes from England, comes from other countries where this has been looked at and understood and applied a good bit more than here right now. So why does this matter?
The question is, why does this matter and what does all of this mean? It's important to understand that the effective use of language skills is linked to increased student engagement and decreased aggressive behavior and other types of disruptive and acting out behavior. The research also shows that children and adolescents that lack developmentally appropriate language skills are much more likely to experience peer rejection. They're more likely, for example, to be bullied. And they're subject to feelings of anger, internalized and/or overt anger. In fact, anger may be the symptom, the presenting problem, if you will, that indicates a language skill problem exists, which could be the basic problem. But too often we respond to the anger, the presenting problem, the problem that is in front of us, which we cannot, of course, ignore. But the consequence in our reaction may be more related to a logical consequence if we consider the basic problem. And keep in mind, too, that children and adolescents learn valuable lessons from logical consequences because they can understand the link between their behavior and outcomes. And listen to this. Language skills problems are the most frequent developmental issues among children and adolescents, according to a growing body of research, yet they are the least noticed, and therefore often our response is a remedy and not a solution. So what are some early clues and impacts of language development?
So some very early clues. Language skill development starts early. The number of loving words a baby hears in the first 3 years of life makes a big difference in their language development. Also, language skill development has predictable sequences. So for example, although individual differences do exist, by age 2, most children know about 50 words and combine them into short phrases. By kindergarten, they will demonstrate greater self-regulation and academic skills and fewer externalizing and internalizing problem behaviors. So this link is very important. Don't forget this part. Language skills directly impact self-regulation. And this continues on, so we're going kind of in a developmental trajectory. Evidence suggests that the most important factor to achieve the expected levels in reading and math at age 7 is a child's language skill at age 5. And research has shown that the language skill factor is greater than the link to poverty and level of parental education. It continues. By the end of elementary school, only 15% of students with language skill problems achieve the expected level in reading, compared to 61% of their peers. And the pattern continues into adulthood, as children with poor language skills at age 5 are 4 times more likely to have reading problems. As adults and adolescents, 3 times as likely to be diagnosed with mental health disorder, and twice as likely to be unemployed. So what do problems with language skills look like?
Let us consider the problems with expressive and receptive language skills. You heard Ariane talk about expressive and receptive language earlier and what those look like. Regarding expressive language skills, this includes children and adolescents who have a low vocabulary compared to their peers, and you can see, as we noted earlier in the research, why they would be more likely to experience peer rejection and become very frustrated. They leave out words when talking, use tenses incorrectly, and even struggle oftentimes to put words together correctly. So they use choppy sentences or incomplete sentences, which, as you can imagine, hampers social interactions, interrupts simple conversations. They're negatively impacted, and expressive language problems negatively impacts engagement in learning. Now, with receptive language problems, this is when children and adolescents struggle to understand what's being said and therefore have problems following instructions or directions in the spoken format. They simply have problems understanding what others are saying to them or to a group of students. When you're talking to them, they may look at you with a blank expression, which can be misinterpreted. If you say something to your own child or your grandchild, for example, and they just stare back at you without saying a word, what's your reaction? Children and adolescents with receptive language issues may also have problems organizing their thoughts and sometimes act out or withdraw when their social environment becomes just too difficult for them to understand. It's just too confusing and overwhelming for them. Think of your own behavior when two people are talking to you at the same time. What is your reaction? You just want to say, and maybe sometimes you do say, be quiet, just be quiet. I don't understand. But many times that's exactly how children with receptive language issues react too, and that's how they feel. With expressive and receptive language problems, there will be pragmatic language issues such as difficulty answering or responding to questions. Their responses, for example, may just seem unrelated. Difficulty starting and keeping up with conversations. They may make inappropriate comments or make comments that have nothing to do with the conversation, which draws usually some strange expressions from their friends or adults that makes the child or adolescent feel even more self-conscious. And all of these become even worse in high stress, unfamiliar, or even socially complicated situations when social engagement is expected. And keep in mind, we are talking about language skills that are fundamental to everyday conversation. And we add this to the mix in an effort to be more engaging and to liven up our conversations. We often add idioms and analogies, similes and metaphors. For example, we say things like, she gave me the cold shoulder. The homework is a breeze. Nothing is written in stone. Imagine for a moment if you're already having problems with everyday conversational language and then someone uses a metaphor. How would you feel? How would you reply? Well, look at these. What if I said to you during a conversation we were having about our busy day, and I said, that's like a Thompson's Colt. If I could see your face now, I'd see a blank expression on your face because you don't know what this means or what this has to do with our conversation. And after seeing that blank face, look on your face, I might say, oh, what's the matter? Didn't you hear what I said? I might say after seeing your blank expression, cat got your tongue? Right. I throw another metaphor at you. That's the way many of our children and adolescents feel when they don't have the language skills to understand. And by the way, in case you're wondering, these were the most common expressions in the 19th century in the United States. As we mentioned earlier, it's important to remember that we get distracted by behavior problems, the presenting problem. And our reactions, our comments, and consequences that we select are based on that distraction. That distraction is our reaction to the presenting problem of behavior. Many, if not most of the time, reacting to the presenting problem prevents us from considering what's really driving the behavior, what's causing the behavior, which leads us to assign a cause or to label the behavior. In other words, we are quick to characterize the behavior because we want a quick remedy. And to add more complexity to this problem is our belief, our mistaken belief that we are good at characterizing behavior. The reality of the matter is that we're not very good at characterizing behavior because, frankly, we're not very accurate. And how we characterize behavior has more to do with attribution than anything else. If I ask you right now, if you've heard of attribution, most of you would shake your head no. I once asked an audience of over 1,500 people, said, raise your hand if you've heard of the word attribution, and only one hand went up. And that's because he misunderstood the question. It amazes me that we don't talk more about attribution because it impacts all of us every day of our lives. So what is attribution? Attribution is this. Our response to someone's behavior has more to do with why we think they did it than what they actually did. I can see you now. You're looking at the monitor right now with a quizzical look on your face saying, what did he just say? So let me repeat that. Our response to someone's behavior has more to do with why we think they did it than what they actually did. That's why we are so inconsistent with things like discipline. We're even inconsistent with how we discipline our own children because we're responding to our attribution of why we think they did what they did, which is more important than what they did. But let me ask you this, what happens when we attribute the wrong cause to the behavior? This is an important question. What happens when we attribute the wrong cause to the behavior? What happens when we make that error? That's considered the fundamental attribution error, which is important. Why? Well, this is why. Ladies and gentlemen, let's be honest. We need to be honest with ourselves. If we think a child or adolescent has an attitude, or seems like they don't care, or appears to be lazy, honestly, what do? Admit it, too many times we write them off. We're finished with them. We don't give them more time, we don't give them more help, and we certainly are not going to waste our time with them. But consider this, what if your attribution was wrong? What if you assigned the wrong cause to the behavior? What if you reacted to the presenting problem as you perceived it? What happens? It often results in a consequence that's not proportional to the behavior, such as an out-of-school suspension for minor behavior. And speaking of out-of-school suspensions, and RN told you and warned you earlier that there would be a test about your new status as an epidemiologist in training. Well, here's the test. This graph shows the number of out-of-school suspensions in Georgia for grades K through 12th grade. What do you see? What do you see? Now, remember, RN earlier trained you to be an epidemiologist, so don't look at the data in the way you normally do. Remember what she said about patterns and clues. And also remember this, you're moving from the remedy system to the solution system. So having given you those clues and looking at it differently now, what do you see? I'll tell you what we hear from most people. They point out the high number of suspensions at the 9th grade. So they want to focus on addressing that problem. In fact, we've heard people shout out, my goodness, what's happening to the 9th grade? We've got to do something. And I certainly understand why, because that data leaps off the graph and you think, gosh, we've got to do something. That 9th grade's out of control. But let me ask you this. Is it possible that we're looking at the data in the same old way, looking for the presenting problem? Frankly, I grew tired of looking at data in the same way. We had the same people looking at the same data year in and year out. So I thought, and I wondered, what other professions look at data? Then it occurred to me that epidemiologists look at data all the time. So let's see what an epidemiologist will say about the same data. Excuse me, and we happen to have an epidemiologist close by. REM. When we showed this data to our friendly epidemiologist, REM, what do you think she said? Before answering the question, she first of all asked me a question, and the question was this: what's the purpose of data? I knew right off that that was a trick question, and I wasn't going to fall for that, so I mumbled some reply. I don't remember what I said. And she said something I always remember. First of all, she said, the purpose of data is to generate more questions. Data should generate at least 2 or 3 more questions. If the data doesn't generate more questions, then you're not looking at the data effectively. You're not looking at it in a different way. Then she looked at this graph, and I expected the epidemiologist to comment on the 9th grade like everybody else does, but you know what she said? First thing our epidemiologist said was, why are you suspending so many little kids? You see, typically our eye goes straight to the apex, the 9th grade, right? And that takes us down the remedy road. Where do you think the problem issues begin? In the 9th grade? Well, of course not. But our epidemiologist wasn't finished. She then said, well, what happens later to these young students that are suspended in kindergarten to the 3rd grade? Do they continue to have problems? Well, we didn't know because we never considered that question. Why? Because we're still focusing on the 9th grade. So to answer that question of what happens to these young students who are suspended, we asked the Governor's Office of Student Achievement to research that question. In the next slide, you'll see what happened. They followed 131,000 students, and guess what they found? Right. Pretty much what the epidemiologists suspected. The children suspended in K through 3rd continue to be suspended in other grades, and they continue to be behind academically. And their problems, you'll see on the next slide, extended into the 9th grade in ELA and algebra, and typically these children have a lower graduation rate. But the epidemiologist wasn't finished yet either. You know how epidemiologists are very persistent. This epidemiologist asked, well, what did the young students in the kindergarten to 3rd grade do? What was their behavior that led to suspension? So we looked at that, and guess what we found? We found that 74% of the K through 3rd grade students were suspended for that category called other. Do you know what other behavior means? What do you think the other category means? I see some of you nodding your head. You know what I'm talking about, right? That's the behavior that's so minor, we don't even have a category name for it. So think of that, 74%, ladies and gentlemen, 74% of the children K through 3rd grade were suspended for minor behavior. So let's pose this question. Based on the research and what we have presented so far today, how many of these young students had language difficulties to the point that their behavior became their language? Some studies have shown that 20 to 30% of our children come to school with underdeveloped language skills. So is it possible that we misinterpret and mischaracterize the behavior of children and adolescents that have language skill deficits as being inattentive, as being defiant, being angry, have an attitude, have cognitive problems, or don't want to engage in learning? Could we be wrong as we attribute cause of the behavior? It's possible, of course, that a child or adolescent does have an attitude and doesn't care. This is not about making excuses for behavior. This is about taking a closer look at behavior and perhaps having a different perspective of behavior. Consider this. This is probably one of the most important points of the presentation. It can help if we reconceptualize behavioral problems as skill deficits. Hear that, skill deficits. And keep in mind that behavior itself is often a form of language. If we can find the skill that is underdeveloped or is the basic problem, we might be able to find a solution. So here's another question for us. Are language skills linked to child and adolescent mental health?
So I think you can see, we're trying to show the linkages across multiple areas. So the link to child and adolescent mental health, often it helps to ask, what do we mean? What is child and adolescent mental health? What is it defined as? According to the Centers for Disease Control, mental health for children and adolescents is defined as the ability to reach developmental and emotional milestones, learn and demonstrate healthy social skills, and cope with problems. too often, and when we do this presentation, often we'll hear an answer that is really reflective of a mental health disorder or a mental illness, but jumping over just what is child and adolescent mental health. So really thinking about birth to 18, these three elements. And remember these three elements as I go through the next few slides, sort of showing linkages. Again, remember, defined as the ability to reach developmental and emotional milestones, learn and demonstrate healthy social skills, and cope with problems. Developmentally appropriate language skills, research shows, have a demonstrated protective effect on child and adolescent mental health. And that protective effect is on mental health development. It's kind of like looking at language skills as a window into a child's social and emotional and mental health development. On the other hand, problems with development of language skills significantly increases the risk of inattention, hyperactivity, and problems with conduct and self-regulation throughout childhood and adolescence. And you kind of heard that earlier in the definitions of language, expressive and receptive and pragmatic. Although it's often not apparent, developmentally appropriate language skills are a significant contributing factor to the prevention of emotional and behavioral problems throughout childhood and adolescence. Again, a presenting problem versus a basic problem. It's really wonderful to begin to know what are those things that can really contribute to, a meaningful growth and healthy social and emotional development. And sometimes this can be seen as really kind of obvious, but it's sometimes helpful just to look at some of the basics. The direction of effect. Studies of children ages 2 to 13 demonstrate that problems with development of language skills predict later behavior problems more strongly than behavior problems predict later language skills. This begins to point us in a good direction. It points to language skills as a useful target to prevent and address behavior issues. This is really powerful research. Research shows the percent of previously unidentified language deficits in children ages 5 to 13 who were identified with emotional and behavioral disorders but had no history of developmental or neurological problems is 81%. So 4 of 5 children considered to have emotional behavioral disorders have an unidentified language deficit. Now, here's the thing, because you're kind of asking, that's a very large proportion. Identification of language skill problems can be difficult. Can be difficult by the fact they're often quickly pathologized. So there's a tendency, not really sure why, but there can be a tendency to pathologize behavior. If we were speaking in front of, there are probably several educators on here, educator audiences, you kind of started to get nods and from teachers, like, oh, I hadn't really thought about that. Like, I'm pathologizing the behavior. I'm attributing maybe a cause to the behavior or making an assumption. And even those who are not necessarily clinically trained to pathologize behavior for whatever is decided, sometimes may pathologize the behavior. Here's a very common example. ADHD, ODD, which stands for oppositional defiant disorder, and conduct disorder share similar characteristics with language skill problems. Here are some characteristics. Difficulty listening when spoken to, problems following instructions, talking excessively, blurting out answers, interrupting, not waiting for turns in conversation. Remember the definitions of language skills: expressive, receptive, pragmatic. And sometimes it may be helpful to think about, is it going to be helpful for me to put a label of this disorder, ADHD? Maybe it's helpful to think a little deeper. Have you ever heard this or said this before, either one of these? Nothing works. I know something's wrong, just can't put my finger on it. It's not always, but given the prevalence, and sometimes it's helpful to think about this, is it language? We want to bring this term to you. It's a term that's been around, but it's one you may not be familiar with. It's called negative emotion differentiation. And bringing up this term, I often want to say, and if you are an educator and you're working with children of all ages, I want to stop and say, I want you to be even more proud. I want you to be even more proud about what you do to grow a child's language skill, whatever you're teaching. If you're a science teacher, those language, they're learning language throughout whatever you're teaching. Good teaching is going to produce language. And it's going to show, what you're going to see here is it's a way of supporting a child's healthy mental health development. So let me break that down really quickly here for you. Negative emotion differentiation is defined as the ability or skill to make distinctions between different negative emotions by applying precise words to describe negative emotional states. So you need to use language to be able to differentiate negative emotions. So children and adolescents with language skill problems have low negative emotion differentiation, typically refer to emotions in general terms: bad, mad. And look at this. Children who have low language skills and are not able to differentiate negative emotions struggle with an important skill called inner dialogue. And that skill of inner dialogue is required to effectively reason, self-regulate, and cope with problems. I hope you're beginning to see some similarities across this whole presentation about definitions and about definitions of mental health, definitions of language, these skills, the skill to have inner dialogue. Do you ever feel stressed out? And this is a very basic example. Do you ever feel stressed out and make a to-do list? Even if it's just in your head, like you don't write it down, but you're kind of overwhelmed and you're thinking through, I've got my to-do list. Do you ever start feeling just a little bit calmer? Like, I can get through this. It's okay. It's going to be okay. Or if you're going through a particular difficult time, you're sort of thinking through things as you're going through, but you're using a lot of language and you don't even notice it. It's a wonderful, wonderful skill to have. Children and adolescents, and many of you adults with strong language skills, have high negative emotion differentiation, and you can use more granular examples to describe your emotions. I feel frustrated, or I feel ashamed. And what that is actually really is a sort of a window into, is that means these children have strong inner dialogue. So again, it's not just that you have bigger words, it's really a window into having a strong inner dialogue, crucial to self-regulate and cope with problems. And the research shows, this is recent research from Starr et al., children are better protected against development of depression. It's a very powerful skill to have. So what does this mean?
Well, operating at the surface level, in other words, at the remedy level, when instead the situation requires a deeper understanding of a child's emotional state, can result in a child or adolescent being judged as selfish or uncaring. Instead, consider the possibility of a language skill problem and how that can impact our responses and our interventions. Think about it. Talk-based psychotherapy for children and adolescents, for example, is often based on the assumption that their language represents their thoughts and feelings, that they have the language skills necessary to express themselves. For children and adolescents who lack developmentally appropriate language skills, this can create a situation that can be confusing and even stressful to the child or adolescent. That's why it's so important. Why is this so important? Because understanding the child and adolescent language skills not only influences the diagnostic process, it could also help determine the most appropriate response. And let's illustrate by looking at a case study. A 10-year-old boy was referred with a diagnosis of psychosis based on his peculiar, very, very odd responses in testing. During therapy sessions, he was extremely active and talkative. Questioning and problem-solving approaches often led to inappropriate and peculiar verbal responses. A language assessment identified a receptive language deficit. When the therapist considered that, he then lowered his expectations of a high-level verbal response and added visual cues like pictures and drawings and such. Then the child's activity level decreased and he was able to work with the therapist. The child was able to draw pictures of the problem situation. He was being teased by his peer group. And then they were able to draw some alternative ways of dealing with frustration and anger. So the therapist used multiple ways of communication, not just verbal. In another case, a 5-year-old student had temper tantrums, and we're talking about on the floor, kicking and screaming and yelling, totally disrupting class every time the teacher instructed the students to move from one activity to another. The teacher, because of her training, and she was aware of language, both expressive and receptive and pragmatic, noticed that the student did not appear to understand the instructions. The teacher thought the student did not understand the concept or the word transition and the instructions related to transitioning. Therefore, she gave the student a stuffed animal as a link to the concept of transition. And guess what happened? The temper tantrum ceased. This stopped what could have been a trajectory towards suspensions. I mean, in most situations like that, what do you think would have happened? And I know what you're thinking. Yes, this child would have been sent to the front office. If it continued, the child may have been told to be suspended for a few days. The trajectory would be towards suspension. Now, Ariane will tell you the DOT story.
This is a case study that occurred in Georgia, in Middle Georgia, and it was the beginning of the kindergarten school year a couple of years ago. A kindergarten teacher made a call to a central office administrator saying that she had a child that was truly out of control. And so this office staff person went to the school, was standing outside of the kindergarten classroom, observed that it was the beginning of the kindergarten school year, and the children were working on worksheets. That's a whole nother story. But what she observed is they were working on numbers in the tens frame. The teacher had instructed them to put a line and then put a dot in the tens frame, to draw a line first and then draw a dot. And overheard the teacher saying to this little boy, "No, I said a dot." And the little boy had drawn another line. And then again, "I said a dot." And again, the little boy drew another line. And this began to escalate even further. The administrative office person, who actually had quite a bit of training in early language and literacy development, walked over and tapped on the teacher on the shoulder and asked, "May I?" And the teacher at that point walked off in a huff. And then this administrator leaned down and asked the little boy, again, the beginning of kindergarten, "Do you know what a dot is?" To which the little boy responded, "No." And so then took an opportunity to quickly do the I do, we do, you do approach and helped the little boy and understand what a dot was. And for the rest of the school year, kind of kept her eye on this little boy who was doing much better. But it's another one of those examples of we shouldn't have to expect the little boy to understand what all the words mean at the beginning of kindergarten in some simple approaches. We're looking at another area related. How do language skills link to child welfare? Children and adolescents who experience trauma are often literally out of touch with their feelings, frequently have no language to describe their internal states. So this lack of inner dialogue, again, remember the inner dialogue, so important, constrains a child's ability to reason effectively, regulate emotions, and cope with problems. Children and adolescents who experience abuse and neglect will try to use language primarily for communicating basic needs, rather than for any social or emotional purpose. It is estimated, so here's prevalence, that 35 to 73% of children in foster care lack developmentally appropriate language skills. That is 3 to 6 times the prevalence rate of the general population. In fact, even more recent research, this research was comparing the pragmatic language skills, remember social communication skills of 42-month-old neglected children to their same age peers, found that 44% of neglected children had pragmatic language deficits compared to only 4% of non-neglected children. And a review of studies examining maltreated school-age children, so again, looking as they continue to grow, found that 86% had significant language skill problems. And children in foster care and their families who are in talk-based behavior therapy and case planning are effectively in a second language environment if their language skills are deficient and have not been addressed. And unfortunately, children in foster care who have deficient language skills, and currently in our system in Georgia, they're not really looked for or considered at the beginning of working with children in foster care, will have problems with approaches and problems with mental health interventions. Educational attainment is lower, more challenging behavior, and again, children with deficient language skills. And children in foster care with language skill problems have longer stays in care than their peers. Here's a case study on Child A's story. Prior to her present placement, a 15-year-old girl had 20 previous placement breakdowns. With a history of aggressive behavior, including being verbally and physically abusive, she had several police charges pending as well. She had previously been identified as having no obvious difficulties with her ability to communicate, but that she would communicate emotion by her behavior. So now hearing this, I think you might find that statement to be kind of interesting. Following staff concern about her inability to understand information, a full language assessment was conducted and revealed a range of unidentified language and communication needs. After the assessment, the foster care staff and family were briefed on how to create a language-rich environment and increase the girl's opportunities to learn and use language. As a result of this enrichment and language skill support, Child A's communication, social skills, and behavior improved significantly. The police charges were dropped, and her social worker said what I've experienced is her improved confidence in expressing herself, listening, and understanding. This has been an invaluable part of the progress she's made in placement and has allowed her greater opportunities to make meaningful relationships with adults and peers alike. So how are language skills linked with disruptive youth?
Well, Ariane talked about some real life examples and we've talked about some case studies. Do you want to hear some more real life impacts? Look at this. According to research, youth who lack language skills are 7 times more likely to misunderstand Miranda warnings than their peers. And it goes deeper. Internationally known researchers Hopkins and Snow found that youth involved with juvenile justice are 5 times more likely than their non-offending peers to have language deficits. However, typically, they're not given a language assessment. Let's look at another practical example of what that might mean. Many schools and courts are implementing restorative practice, which has been found to be effective. And typically a school principal or a juvenile court judge, they want to know, well, how did the juvenile respond in the restorative practice session? Was the young man engaged, young woman engaged in the restorative practice? Did he seem interested? Did they show any remorse? Look what the report may sound or look like if the juvenile or if the student has expressive or receptive language difficulty. You may hear comments like this in the report back to the principal or to the court. The only thing we heard from the student was, yep, no, don't know, maybe. He wasn't engaged, he didn't seem to care. With the receptive language difficulties, the student may appear to understand what is being said, may even nod in agreement every once in a while, but he's missing important nuances during the intervention and is not engaged entirely and lacks the language skills to be engaged in their restorative practice session. So it does have real life implications. As we were doing this research, we found another very interesting and relevant discovery about language skills. Did you know that the expression of remorse is very complex and requires substantially developed language skills? The words must be appropriate, of course, but also the delivery, the tone of voice, facial expression must also match. Let me tell you a quick story. After one of our language presentations, a juvenile court judge came up and said he wanted to tell us a story about how important language is. He said, on a typical day in my court, I had before me one afternoon a 15-year-old young man who was accused of breaking and entering and theft. The juvenile's record did not indicate a history of problems, even though he'd been struggling in school and had various discipline issues, but nothing serious. According to the judge, this young man had been described as quiet and kind of a loner. The prosecutor nor anyone else really wanted any type of severe punishment. The judge said I wasn't even considering putting him on probation. I had in mind just to give him a stern warning and send him on his way. So I tried to interact with the young man, and the judge said, and I got very frustrated because I could get no response from him, no reaction at all. And the judge said I had to admit that I got upset with him, but I was determined not to be upset. So I tried to set a good example. So I, again, tried to engage with him and got no response. So out of frustration, I simply said to the young man, "Well, are you sorry?" And the judge said, to my shock, the young man just exploded in anger. He bolted upright in the chair. So suddenly the chair toppled over and he swept every piece of paper off the table with one exaggerated stroke of his arm and screamed to the judge, "I'm not sorry." The judge said, I was shocked, completely puzzled by his violent outburst. The marshals rushed over and took control. And typically in a situation like that, they would take the child out and put him in a cell. But I said, everybody slow down, stop, let's see what's going on. Because I knew something just wasn't quite right. And what I found out, to make a long story short, was this. He lost his father when he was 3 years old. And when his stepfather came in, stepfather was not very good to him. And he told this young man when he was beginning at age 3, "You're a sorry human being. You're a sorry person. You'll never amount to anything because you're sorry." A young man is now 15 years old. He heard that for 12 years. So when the judge said, "Are you sorry?" that meant totally different to him. So that judge said, "Please tell every audience that you talk to this story because I hope they understand how important language is." Now at this point, you're probably wondering, well, we've heard all the problems and issues. Well, what can we do about it? And that's why we like this quote from Teddy Roosevelt: "Complaining about a problem without proposing a solution is called whining." So we haven't been whining for the last 45 minutes. We've been trying to inform you. So what can we do about it?
So what can be done? These recommendations really cover the age range for beginning really prenatally through adolescence. First, in general, conduct a review of existing policies, procedures, and services for children and adolescents to identify and proactively include opportunities for language-rich interactions and consider implications for those who may have problems with language skills. For example, include language skills as a child well-being indicator. We already do this with vision and hearing. And of course, vision and hearing are additional skills essential for engaging with others. So let's go ahead and include language skills. Integrate language nutrition coaching as a practice within systems that already interact with most parents and babies, including nurses, public health, child welfare, childcare, through continuing education training such as Talk With Me Baby, and embed this as a competency in pre-service degree programs. For babies who are born who spend time in the neonatal intensive care unit, provide supports and opportunities for parents of babies in a NICU to engage in shared reading practices with their babies. Parents of infants admitted to a neonatal intensive care unit describe shared reading as a positive experience that helps them cope with difficult moments, and it actually predicts the likelihood of continued engagement throughout childhood. Expand the use of strategies and routine visits to the doctor that provide parents with guidance about developmentally appropriate language milestones, how to promote their development, recognize difficulties, and proactively seek additional support. Implement a comprehensive approach to universally increase student engagement and strengthen language skills. This is just the beginning of what you're going to hear. Right after this presentation, you're in for a treat with Emily Rubin. You're going to go really deep on addressing and applying the concept of engagement. This is just one example, and we like to think of this in the context of classroom climate and school climate. This concept, and we love this quote, "When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower." So this idea of universal approaches to strengthen language isn't this, and we didn't say this earlier, this isn't about identifying kids for special education. This is about supporting all children and all children's social and emotional, mental health, development, and academic outcomes. So here's an example using a common illustration in the education world, this pyramid. And in the education world, the bottom part of the pyramid referred to as tier 1, and that's universal. The suggestion is to, and this is actually something that's been demonstrated in a community in Georgia. It's called Dublin City. And in this community in Georgia, this work is actually being applied and being demonstrated. So the first thing is train all staff to simply notice developmentally appropriate language skills. Just notice developmentally appropriate language skills for everybody. And we actually have a tool when you're able to we'll send out these slides, and there's a tool called Language Skills by Age Band that can be used for that. The second part is support all teachers' use of whole group student engagement ladders. You're going to hear more about that, to monitor impact of tier 1 instructional practices on engagement of all learners. So again, in this whole group student engagement ladder, you'll have access to this freely accessible tool. You'll hear more about this in a little while. Then the next step is, if there are some students who are noticed in this whole group review on multiple occasions regarding their engagement level, maybe the engagement level is a bit lower on a consistent basis, use a screener to identify potential problems with language skills. You could use something as simple as a PPVT, and we have a list of what those stand for, but some really simple screens. And then the next step, now, before I say this, be honest, how many of you are looking at the top of that pyramid? In the current situation, the current system, and we're building the new system that makes the existing system obsolete, it's kind of, we don't even really think about it. We just look straight up the pyramid because we've done a screen. Well, did you know you could actually use those screening results, kind of the canary in the coal mine, to enhance language-rich instructional practices and continue to monitor whole group student engagement? And really, those practices of having peers interact more with their peers, building language, not separating out. And in that way, for those few individuals, and this actually did happen in Dublin City, just the 1 or 2 that need a little bit of extra, that way you don't overtax the system and more children succeed. This is kind of building that new system.
And with that, we can provide training for teachers to monitor development of language skills throughout all grade levels. And you may be thinking, well, teachers cannot be asked to do any more than they're doing now. But our experience with teachers has been this: when we give this presentation to teachers, they immediately think of students this could apply to. We spoke to a group of 400 teachers not too long ago, and the feedback was, I know students that this applies to. I know exactly who you're talking about. I know what to do. I know things that we can do. So we can illustrate to teachers, and Emily is going to really enrich your life by talking about how to create a language-rich classroom. And this is what we can say and train teachers and others to do. How are the students communicating? Who's doing most of the talking? In some classrooms that we've observed, over 90% of the words spoken are from the teacher. And that's the same in some homes where adults dominate all the conversation. So we're just talking about developing a language-rich environment where children have a chance to practice their language and learn how to convey their language. How are you communicating? Is that working well? And this applies to all of us who work with children and adolescents, regardless of what your role is. Is there anything that can be changed to make the communication easier? We suggest frequently to teachers to divide the class into small groups because that enhances engagement. look out for jargons. And consider this: what words or phrases might be confusing? Write down the jargon word or phrase if you need to use it, and let the children talk about it. Explain concepts simply and with illustrations, and let children explain the concepts to each other, and watch them and listen to them as they interact with each other. Have children draw it. Children love to draw, no matter the age. Teenagers love to draw too. Don't let anybody kid you otherwise. And have children explain their drawings. The main thing is to check for understanding. And other things you can do, for example, in the classroom, say this: raise your hand if you can explain this to other students. And again, you'll hear more about the engagement and the importance of engagement from Emily Rubin in just a few minutes.
And looking at this on the screen and thinking about this new pyramid that's started to be adopted in Dublin City, the truth is we found going in that you're really looking at close to 40 to 50% of kids who had really language skill issues. And so you wouldn't want to go to a place of moving kids out of the classroom when you're looking at such a high percentage. But the good news is there's so much you can do about it. And what was beautiful is the teachers began using the approaches and concepts that you're going to hear more about. In other areas and other systems, screen, assess, and monitor language skills using valid and reliable screen and assessment is part of all evaluations or reevaluations for individualized education programs. So for those children who do have an IEP, include this as standard practice. Screen and assess and continuously monitor language skills of all children and adolescents in foster care and in juvenile justice. Nearly half of the kids in foster care in the state of Georgia, half the kids birth to age 6, in foster care age birth to 6, and the largest proportion are birth to 3. Consider the language skill issues and development. And provide training to increase awareness and understanding of the relationship between language skill development and mental health development, so we're appropriate in responding to meet the needs of children. Another resource we have is the Signals webinar series, and that was created in partnership with the Sandra Deal Center for Early Language and Literacy. This is on our NAMI Georgia website. We have that listed below, but this is a good interactive webinar series that can help understand signals that can be missed when we think about the presenting issue without considering the basic issue. And train mental health providers to complete a brief language screening as part of initial assessment for all children and adolescents referred to them, and apply the findings to inform the diagnostic process and interventions considered. And finally, given what is known about pathways into the justice system, sometimes referred to, unfortunately, as the preschool to prison pipeline, screen and assess and monitor language skills at these 6 key points, if nothing else. Among students struggling to read, when behavioral problems first start, when a kid is at risk of suspension from school, when mental health difficulties are apparent, on first contact with the justice system, and in planning interventions following a conviction. Because is this the system we want to continue? Or is it time to create a new system that is solution-based? Solutions, not remedies. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ariane and Dr. McGivney. I've heard this presentation before, but I learned something new each time. So we appreciate that. I do have a few questions for you. You know, this particular moment we're in, where children have been out of school since March, and who knows when they'll be back, what should we be on the lookout for related to this research? Like, what are some things that should raise an eyebrow if we see it and say, maybe that's sort of the result of a language deficit or the social distancing or whatever caused by this moment?
Well, I think one thing that we will see, and what we've already heard teachers concerned about, and is another reason why Emily's presentation is so critical today, is trying to re-engage children in learning and re-engage children in social activity. Many of them have been pretty much in isolation. Many of them have been essentially quarantined for several months now, for the lack of a better word. And engagement, learning engagement and social engagement really are learned skills that have to be practiced, and they have to be practiced in multiple types of settings. And we just haven't had that experience for children the last several months. So again, I'm being redundant, but Emily's presentation could not be more timely, because I think the biggest challenge is going to be re-engaging children in life, really re-engaging them in learning and re-engaging them in social interaction.
Yeah, and along to that point as well, we are in virtual meetings with a lot of different partners, and sometimes the assumption that we're going to see all children are going to need to receive mental health services, you know, sort of really thinking about support. So it's not that we wouldn't want to support a child's mental health, but really thinking about that engagement, how important it is, and thinking about building those skills. And children engaging with each other, that skill is so important. So again, I'm going to underscore the importance of the next presentation again around engagement, and as a key opportunity to address the question, Akia. Thank you.
Okay, just along those lines, there are several tips and suggestions and strategies laid out. Some of them I would like you to go into a little bit more detail about, because all of us here are not teachers or policymakers, so we might wonder what we can do as a community person or as a woman who's just walking down the street and sees a little kid and doesn't actually have one of her own. That's me I'm describing. What are some things that we can do, those of us who are community partners or neighbors or friends, not necessarily policymakers or teachers, to sort of engage in this work?
Well, one early opportunity, and I speak as a really trained as a perinatal and early childhood epidemiologist, is in general talk with our babies. So that's one area, and I know we mentioned that briefly in the recommendations, and you can look at talkwithmebaby.org for a lot more detail. But there's still a lot of people who don't know, why would I talk with my baby? My baby doesn't talk with me, you know? So really that loving interaction, really language is a vehicle. So really it's the engagement that's happening, and it's building language, but the engagement's happening first. But knowing that I can sing to my baby, you know, I can make funny sounds, all of that verbal and nonverbal interaction, and knowing how powerful that is. That's the language nutrition piece. So that's one area, but of many different parts of the developmental stage.
And we have, I'll just add this along the same lines, Akia, is that we often have chances to interact with children. And if you kind of observe yourself, we do most of the talking. We don't ask enough questions. We don't engage them enough to get them to talk. We can create more language-rich homes, language-rich service agencies. We can do more of what we talked about today by encouraging children to engage more. And I saw in the chat room a very good question. I think Dawn brought it up, and I think Emily will talk about this too, is we're hearing more and more almost every day now that another school system is going to go 9 weeks, and how do you engage children virtually? And Emily's, I think, is going to talk about that as well, because she has some very specific and very powerful things that we can do online, because that engagement is going to have to continue apparently for the next several weeks in many communities.
One final question, and sort of related to Talk With Me Baby. Do you find that it's more difficult to gauge if a child has a language deficit if English is a second language in their home, or perhaps not even the language spoken?
That is such an important question. And I was doing a training with nursing students recently, and really hadn't been familiar with having more than one language is a real powerful thing to have. Mm-hmm. And there tends to be a myth that speaking in the language of your heart, really. So first, the importance of families knowing that they, you know, the way you would naturally say I love you to your child, use your native language. That's authentic. That's authentic language. It's actually building the capability. Some studies show that although the increase in sort of standard scores may be a little bit later, that is growing more than one language is building the brain. It's really a powerful skill to have. So again, language is a powerful vehicle. And not really making an assumption first that a child is going to have difficulty reading, and really building the strength of having language, having more than one language.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Ariane and Gary, for those powerful presentations. Thank you for everybody who attended. We hope to see you in about 13 minutes. We'll have the amazing Emily Rubin doing an amazing presentation. You've heard all of these things that she's going to answer for you. So we look forward to you joining us again in about 12 minutes or so.
No pressure on that, all of you. Thank you. I'll be here, and when you all come back, we'll be starting up around 2 o'clock.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
Take care and
Gary
stay
Ariane.
safe.
Thank you.